Well, welcome back, everybody. This is our second video in a small series of videos designed to educate people on the importance of room acoustics and what you can do to improve your home theater or recording studio space. We're thrilled to have back with us today acoustics guru Anthony Grimani, who's going to take a slightly deeper dive in this video. And if you haven't seen the first video, you may want to go back and watch that before watching this one. But either way, we're thrilled to have him here. Anthony, welcome back.
Hi, Christopher. How are you today?
I'm doing great, man. It's good to see you.
Good to see you. Yeah, the first video, I like to think of it as the first layer of the onion. Acoustics is a pretty deep field, extremely deep, very advanced if you want to. And so today we're going to go to the next layer of the onion. I'm not going to make you, Christopher, into a doctorate on acoustics with this, but I'm just going to expose the next layer of this beautiful, tasty onion.
Right. I love it.
We're going to keep talking about the part of acoustics that is about sound reflection control, how sound leaves a loudspeaker or an instrument and propagates around a room, passes your ear, and bounces around the space, and what it does to your perception of the sound quality. So I am going to open a little presentation because I love doing it this way, and it keeps me on track. Otherwise, I just start talking about all kinds of wacky stuff. And we're going to do this deeper dive into sound reflection control. Now, let's take a little bit of a philosophy tour here. What are we trying to do? Let's say you love classical music, and you love going to concerts. Because they're great. There's a picture of the Concert Gebouw in Amsterdam. Great place to go watch classical music. If you ever are in Europe and you're in Amsterdam, make sure you get a ticket and go over here. It's fantastic. So this room has its own acoustical thumbprint. The musicians are in there. They're playing. It blooms. You feel like you're in there with them. Musicians are in front, the rooms are around you, there's an audience. You really feel like you are at a concert in a community of music lovers. By the way, if I replaced that picture with a stage and a rock band, same feeling. There's the band, they're playing, the audience is around you, the sound system is blasting. You feel like you're out at this venue enjoying this performance. Now, what's interesting is your ear brain is always analyzing, where am I? What's the space? And when you're in this big concert hall, there's a thumbprint that tells you, okay, I'm in this space that's this big, because you hear the musicians playing, then there's a reflection off these surfaces that comes a certain distance later, and other reflections and a reverb, and ultimately, your ears and brain are always at work doing that, going, how big is this space? How far away are things? Are they over here? Are they over here? And it's all happening in your subconscious. And if a concert hall is well built and the musicians are good and the conductor is good and the music's all good, it's a glorious experience. So in the concept of high fidelity, we're going to want to bring that home. When we bring that home and we play it in a small room in which we haven't done anything to its acoustical thumbprint, you're trying to reproduce that event of being at a concert, whether it's classical or rock or jazz, whatever you love to listen to. And no matter how good the recording is, no matter how good your speakers and amplifiers and gear are, your brain always knows, I'm in this room and it's only, 20 feet long by 16 foot wide, 9 foot tall. And while the music sounds good, I'm not at the concert hall. Mm-hmm. Same would be if we're talking about a movie soundtrack. A movie soundtrack puts you into continuously varying environments. There may be a scene that starts with two guys like us talking in a kitchen over coffee in the morning. Then it goes outside in the streets of New York City, and you have all this clatter and noise from being outside. Then it goes into maybe the entrance hallway of a big building, and there's all this reverb, and all of these spaces, as they're created, make you feel like you're in this movie. Now you're playing this at home, and no matter what's going on in this movie, it's your brain and your ears working together say, yep, I'm in this space because I hear those reflections. So what we really want to talk about is how to eliminate that sound field that is room limited. How do we break up that reflected energy so that the thumbprint of your listening area or your recording studio, wherever you're listening to your speakers, so that that thumbprint doesn't add a continuous sauce on top of the program material, and instead you can feel like you're either in a concert hall, in an entrance lobby, outside on the street, in a train, in a plane, underwater, in space, even though normally in space you don't hear anything, right?
Yeah. And
So
it's just to throw in, it's kind of what you touched on in the first video, where you just don't want the room physically influencing what you're trying to listen to because that's fatiguing. Your brain has to do a lot of extra crunching. For cinema, it's going to take you out of the scene. And for a recording person, there's just going to be bad juju going on in your mix that you're trying to fight through to hear what your speakers are doing so you can mix accurately. Is that fair to
right.
say?
Right. You want to hear reality when you're recording and mixing. You don't want to hear the room. You want to hear what's in the music.
Right.
When you're just listening, you want to believe you're at the concert hall. You want to believe you're in the movie. So the whole thing is about believing. Now you want to believe. And as long as the room has a lot of its obvious acoustical thumbprint that your brain goes, I'm in a room that's 20 by 16. It just knows. It's just been programmed to know. As long as it's there, it's hard to really get into it. The whole point is to get you into the movie or into the music if you're listening, or allow you, if you're actually recording and mixing, allow you to hear into the music and make it perfect. So conversation today is going to be about that. It's going to be about acoustics, and why we talk about it is simply because they're very, very audible and they contribute to over 50% of the sound quality you're perceiving. We'll keep this simple. Let's say half of the quality is the gear you bought and have installed. The other half is that interface, the actual acoustical character between the speakers in your ear and what's bouncing around in the room.
So the room is actually part of your rig,
It is.
if you will.
It's part of the system.
Yeah.
Now, some people are in rooms that go, well, the acoustics in here are terrible. It is what it is, and I'll just have to work with it. No, not so. They are fixable. Without spending a whole bunch of money, you can actually improve a room pretty substantially to neutralize it out. So, if you are in the business of selling gear, like if anybody who's watching here is installing studios, selling studio equipment, installing home theaters, installing hi-fi, fixing those acoustics can actually make you money because you're actually helping the end user client to get to better sound, and you're selling some materials. If you are listening to this and watching this because you are on the receiving end of all this and you want to make sure you have good sound, I would change that to say fixing acoustics can save you money. Because I say this because I've talked to a lot of people that have swapped their speakers around. They've spent, another $12,000 to get new speakers and new amps. And they've done this, they've done that on all of the gear. And no matter what, the thumbprint of the room is sitting on top of all that gear. And you're spending money on the wrong solutions. So
Right.
fixing acoustics, if you're actually an end user, can save you money. If you're a professional in selling and installing and tuning studios and home theaters, home cinemas, as they call them in some other countries, or hi-fi rooms, will make you money. It's not a Band-Aid that you have to suffer through. It's actually good for everybody. So what's acoustics? In another broad philosophical way, I look at it as the interface between the speaker, the room, and the listener. So you have here's a little diagram. On the electronic side, whether you're looking at a studio or a residential system, you have sources that may be either instruments or things that are recorded. They go into preamps or encoders or mixers. They go into equalizers if you tune the room correctly. They go into amplifiers. And today, all of that is very good for a very modest price. It's remarkable what you can get for not nearly as much money, Christopher, as when you and I were young. Remember what that stuff cost back then? It was insane.
Oh, yeah.
So it's gotten very good and very, very under control. Now you take that signal, you feed it to a speaker, and you blast it into the room, and that last blast where the waves are going from the speaker to your head and then bouncing around the room is the final interface between the source of the music and you. And if you don't control it, all bets are off. It's not going to sound good. It's not going to sound believable.
And
So,
that's why people will say that their mixes don't translate from their
yeah,
studio to the car or someone else's house or
yeah,
another system.
yeah. You may have great speakers. Actually, let's go back. You may have great musicians playing a really good song, well produced, and that you may be a really good mixer, and you may have really good speakers, really great electronics, and all of that's coming through. And in the last link of that whole chain of events, you have this interface, you have this acoustical environment. It's completely polluting everything you hear. You're making the wrong mix decisions, and
Right.
when you bring it somewhere else, it doesn't translate. Maybe the snare drum's too far forward, too far back, singer's too far forward, too far back. You've got so much verb, things are swimming away, but you couldn't hear it.
Yeah.
So let's talk about that. Let's say you are actually deciding how much to turn the amount of reverb in there. If you're in a room that's already reverberant, you're not going to really hear that very well. You may have to step really heavy on the amount of verb before you go, okay, that voice is well surrounded by verb. And then you go to a room that's not so echoey, and you're like, what's all this mess? Sounds terrible.
Yeah. We've all
So
been there.
we've all done
Likely.
that.
Yeah.
So you really want to hear reality. You really want to hear a good reference. So I think of this acoustical interface in a few different ways. So I'm going to give you another diagram. Imagine you have the sound of a really nice, even, round, oval tone. Something, Christopher, give me something when I come to, when I'm saying, look, a sound that's this beautiful round oval. What instrument would that be?
I think of an oboe.
An oboe. Okay, nice and not a saxophone that's going, "Arr!" but something like really pure. Okay, so you've recorded this oboe. It's a great musician. The reeds on the oboe were nice and clean and new, and the microphone you used, everything was great. And what you want to hear of that is this really nice, even, round, pure tone. Well, the direct sound from your good speaker to your listener is going to be clean if it's a good speaker. What I'm showing here is a view of a room seen from the top. At this top area is the speaker and this little icon that looks like a box and a horn, whatever. And then that's where the sound's going to where your seating position is, your mix position, your seating position. Now, a reflection off the wall is going to play the oboe again, or is going to propagate off the side of the speaker, because today's speakers are all pretty broad dispersion, and it's going to give you two oboes, one playing just a little bit after the other. And rather than be clean and round and even, now you have a second oboe coming from somewhere else, and it's gotten a little polluted. Those of you listening to this who have done recording and mixing and have taken an instrument, delayed it by 2 or 3 milliseconds, and added it back into the original instrument, know exactly what that sounds like. It's like this really comb-phasey, comb-filtered, nasty sound. So that's one reflection off the left wall. Another reflection off the right wall further blurs it. Reflections off the back wall further blow it. More reflections, it gets even more blurry. And then by the end of all the reflections you hear in these rooms, which in a typical, smallish room up to 20 or 25 feet, you may hear 4, 5, 6 reflections bouncing around that pass your head. You end up with this completely blurred oboe. And not only is the quality of it blurred, but also its location in space is blurred. It's a mess. You can't be mixing this way, and you can't be listening to the sound of a really good oboe this way.
It's fatiguing, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So we'll talk about that fatigue in a second. Why is it fatiguing? So I'm going to go to a diagram over here that uses a saxophone rather than an oboe. But imagine Imagine you're listening to a saxophone playing out of the center speaker of a system that's got 3 front channels for immersive audio, left, center, and right. And the sound of that saxophone is coming out of the speaker nice and clean. It's reaching the first sound, the direct sound is reaching your head nice and clean. There's a bounce here off the left wall. By the time it comes back to you, that saxophone's going to sound like it was run over by a car, or that oboe is going to sound like, I don't know what happens when you run over an oboe with a car. It's not going to sound good. Now, did you know, here's an interesting little piece of data. Did you know that in a typical seat, in a typical either mixed position, unless you're like right on the speakers, typical seat, 12 feet, 13, 14 feet away from your speakers, there's actually more reflected sound energy than the direct sound. Look at this.
Wow.
So this is a view from the top. The direct sound's in black. The reflected sounds are in blue, and this is just a few of them. I'm not showing you the ceiling and floor. I'm not showing you past 2 or 3 reflections, but look at that. There's one vector of sound going directly to you, and then there's one other reflected one, another reflected one, another reflected one. By the time you're at the typical seat position in a listening room, a home theater, or a mastering room, or a mixed room where you're more than 10 feet away from the speakers, and you really, once you're mixing, you're not listening to those near fields that are sitting right there. You want to listen to like proper speakers that are at some distance. You actually are hearing 2 or 3 times more reflected sound than direct, especially if the room is untreated. So
That's crazy.
That's crazy. So
Yeah.
what I mean by that is there's one directional vector that goes from the speaker to you. It goes into your ears, and then there's all these other bounces that go into your ear canal. Now your brain has to deal with the fact that that oboe or that saxophone, that snare drum, that door closing in a movie soundtrack is reproduced multiple times. And in fact, the reflections multiply it so much that it's 2 to 3 times louder. So another point of philosophy here, I'm just approaching this from many different places, is we need to reduce and break up the reflected energy. We do not want to eliminate it. Okay, I'm going to say this now a few times. We want to reduce it. We still want some of it in there. But ultimately, we want to get to a point in our listening rooms where there's a higher direct to reflected ratio than in typical untreated rooms. Now, here's yet another view. I'm just expanding on this. This is a view of us now in a room. I've turned it over this way, seen from the top. We're surrounded by 7 loudspeakers for a room that either is a 7-channel system or the base layer of an immersive audio system that may have some speakers up on the ceiling. So let's look at this again. This is the direct sound, one path from the speaker to your head. The right side reflections, I originally just showed one bouncing off the wall, but speakers, again, I said this just a few seconds ago, typical good speakers have a dispersion that is straight on axis good, and then the good ones 10 degrees, 20, 30, almost out to 40 or 55 degrees on axis are pretty much the same. They actually propagate very evenly this way. And I'm showing you what happens to the sound vector that's 10 degrees off axis from your head. So it doesn't actually pass your ear, doesn't hit your ear, it just passes and hits the back wall and bounces around, right? And Christopher, this starts to look a little bit like your room, where your back wall is hard and flat. You've got some stuff on there, but no treatment. So
Right.
that sound at 10 degrees off axis from the horizontal straight line bounces here, 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 and finally comes back to your ear after it's bounced around. The 20-degree sound would do this, 30 degrees off axis would do this, 40 degrees would do that. And so 45 degrees would do that, and at about 50 degrees it bounces there, 60 degrees it bounces there. So these are the reflections off the right wall. And you can see that just from the right wall there's quite a few more red lines than there is the blue line.
It's
Now,
amazing.
that's amazing. Now there's another wall. There's a left wall also, and I won't put those individually, but here's the left wall reflections. So we have reflections from the right wall, from the left wall, from the ceiling, from the floor. And by the time you're sitting 10, 12 feet away, 13 feet away from the speakers, 3-4 meters away from the speakers, there is 2 to 3 times more reflected energy, even maybe 4 times if the room is really, really hard and echoey, than direct sound. And ultimately, you're listening to chaotic reflected sound of the room. You're listening to the room.
Right.
You're not listening to the music.
And nobody wants to do that.
Right. Now, there's a point at which you who are listening should go, what's he talking about? I'm listening to my speakers. I can tell that the sound is over there. You're right. So there is this interesting process in our brain, which is actually known as precedence effects, that gives you directional perception. We focus on the first arriving sound. So I'm putting the same room on here. There's the first arriving sound. That's when you go, the sound is from there. That comes from our instinctive preservations that we learned over a few million years that says, when there's a thing from over there, with really sharp teeth, and the sound of that thing is also bouncing off the walls of the cave or off trees around there, I'm going to ignore the second and third and fourth arriving sound, and I'm going to look at the first arriving one, the thing with the really sharp teeth, and I'm going to run in the other direction. Those of us who were born without that, by the way, they just died and they didn't propagate, didn't reproduce, and they went away. That lineage died out. So for that focus to work well, the reflection patterns need to be consistent. So there needs to be a pretty good replica of the sound. So that means you need to have speakers that have a good off-axis response. But it takes brain power. So while you're sitting there listening to music out of a pair of speakers or listening to a movie out of 3 front speakers, some sides, some backs, and some tops, your ears are receiving all these sound reflections, and your brain's getting all that info, and it needs to process out the ones that are the second, third, fourth arriving sounds and go, that's where the source of sound is going, and ultimately that's fatiguing.
And I would bet it even keeps a low level of adrenaline in your system because it's a survival,
Right. Right.
system.
It's fatiguing and stressful because
Yeah.
your brain keeps going, oh my God, rather than enjoy this piece of music, I'm like, I don't know, is this dangerous? What is this? I don't know. And so it's not fun. I talked to a sound mixer years ago in a room after we redid it, did the acoustical treatments and all of this stuff, and asked him, hey, how's the sound? Are you happy with it? It's like, happy? Oh my God, I can work 8 hours now and not have a giant headache.
Right. I
Oh
love
yeah,
it.
before we redid all this, after 5-6 hours, I was done. I was spent. I couldn't keep working. So that was an interesting realization that this fatigue factor can, if you're actually a sound mixer or an editor, a person who's producing soundtracks for a living, after 5 or 6 hours, you're useless. And just by getting the room properly acoustically tuned, you can increase your efficiency of work for an extra 2 or 3 hours. And then after that, it's beer time. You got to stop.
No, but
So
that's so true. And we've all worked in rooms, if you've been on the recording side of things, where you just walk out of there like a zombie. You're just fried,
you're thrashed.
you know?
Yeah. And sometimes people, what they do to get around that is just turn the level up more to like try to ignore the
Yeah,
sound reflections. That's the wrong direction. That's going to zombie you 10 times more. So
right.
a little more science here, and I I'm gonna peel another layer of the onion now. You ready? So
Do it.
let's look at all these reflections. Let's go back to this, and instead of looking at them as vectors on a plan, let's look at them in the time domain. Let's imagine a speaker is playing a rim shot, thwack, and that sound is going to your head, and then it's bouncing around the room. Let's look at what that would look like if you looked at it in the time domain, if you actually looked at it on a recording, and instead of looking at waves, you looked at an actual level. So this is your head after receiving the rim shot from the speaker. The direct sound's nice and clean. Let's say you have a good speaker, and you hear the thwack of that. And then a little bit later in time, you're going to hear the reflections off the left and right wall. Just a little bit later. Then this is in an untreated room. This is where I'm assuming you guys are all starting. That's why you're spending time listening to me babble on. Then you get some other reflections, a ceiling, a floor, and a back wall. So you have a cluster of reflections here, another cluster of reflections there. Then you get some more reflections that have bounced maybe twice. So a sound that's left the speaker, bounced off the left wall, the right wall, and arrived at you. Here's another cluster. Then there's another cluster of reflections, another cluster of reflections. And what that looks like is your brain is going, okay, I have a direct sound, and then I'm hit over here, and then I'm hit there, and I'm hit there, and I'm hit here. And it's like, oh my God, this is stressful, fatiguing, and confusing. This is what happens in a room with no treatment. What we want to get to is a room in which the sound reflections are still there. The second time I say this, you want to maintain sound reflections. You just want to take control of them. You want to turn them down a little bit. You want to redirect them. You want to scatter them so that the reflection pattern, instead of being these big chunks that feel like you're sleeping on a bed that's like really uncomfortable with springs that are sticking up, instead it's like this velvety, smooth reflection pattern where there still are reflections, they're lowered, and they're spread out evenly over time.
And
This
is
sounds,
that where, excuse me, is that where you would have the right blend of, say, absorbers, diffusers,
yeah,
and bass trap?
yeah, you're starting to give it away. The way you get there is a blend of the right kind of materials, and I'm about to
Gotcha.
talk about that. But
Awesome.
so, philosophically, if you're just trying to make a picture of all of this, The first element in the picture is you want to listen to music so that it sounds like you're in a concert hall. Or in the studio where it was recorded, whatever was the acoustical character and thumbprint of the original performance. Maybe it was outdoors, whatever it is, and you don't want to be listening to it where it's constrained by the character of your room. If you're watching a movie, you want to feel like you're traveling around with the heroes and all the different protagonists in this movie, and you're going from inside to outside in a plane, whatever. And you don't want it to always feel like, yep, I'm always in this room with James Bond. That's wrong. So that's the first thing. Second thing is the room is an interface between that speaker and your ears, and that interface is going to add a thumbprint. It's going to be uncomfortable. It's going to be fatiguing. It's going to really pollute your sound and inaccurate.
Yeah.
And ultimately, where we're trying to get to is we want to reduce the amount of reflected energy and scatter it over time. Now, the tools we're going to use are, and there's a lot of ways to enact this. There's a lot of ways to get to this, but the tools we're talking about today is a judicious choice of absorber devices and other devices. So absorbers basically act as a sponge. They get rid of the sound. They don't return it to the room. They basically convert it into heat. And then other devices are scattering panels, sometimes known diffusers, things that take the sound waves and scatter them evenly in the room. Don't get rid of them. Just redirect them in the room into smaller pieces so that they're still in the room, but reduced in level and spread out in time so that they don't have as strong of an acoustic thumbprint. Now, how much of this stuff do we put in there? So, Christopher, you sell absorbers and diffusers, right?
Correct.
You'd want to tell people, put them everywhere. Just get a whole bunch of them, right?
No, I wouldn't. I want them to have the results that you're talking about today.
But
not
wait,
do overboard.
But wait, you sell treatments. Don't you want people to just fill their rooms with treatments, all the walls, the ceiling, everywhere?
No, we want people to have success. That's why we exist. That's what we're all about.
Right. So success, what does that mean? So I often see rooms that are treated with absorber panels everywhere, all over the walls, the ceiling, the floor, or a lot of absorbers and diffusers filling the whole back wall, of diffusers filling the ceiling. There is such a thing as too much of a treatment. So these things are often called treatments. Think of them as in medicine. A little bit of ibuprofen is good to reduce that headache you have from too many hours mixing. A whole jar of it, probably not good, right? We know that. So let's talk about why not. So in sound field perception, if reflections turn your oboe into something, splintery sounding, your saxophone into something that sounds like you just ran it over with a car, shouldn't we just get rid of all the reflections? That would be the initial thought. Kind of like if you have a really bad headache, why don't you just take the whole jar of ibuprofen? Well, somehow we know you don't take the entire jar of it. And you may not know that putting too much of the stuff on the wall is going to cause a problem. And some people know, well, it's going to make the room sound too dead. Well, what does that mean? What does too dead mean? Well, what's interesting is if you're in a room, you expect some amount of sound reflections. If you get rid of all of them, now your brain's like, what's going on here? I can see a wall here and a ceiling there and a floor there, but there's nothing coming back. So that actually creates a cognitive dissonance where your brain's going, what? And sometimes that's even worse than having a room with reflections. It's just completely deadening.
People can't spend more than 8 minutes in an anechoic chamber. There's like $1 million offer to spend an hour in one, and nobody can do it.
Right. So an anechoic chamber is a room that's used either by speaker companies to measure their speakers or by aerospace companies to put a device in there and measure its radiation and reflection. It basically is a room that's filled with 3 feet or 6 feet, a meter or 2 meters of really thick absorption, usually in wet shape, that gets rid of every reflection in the room. And you stand in there and you talk to somebody and you're sort of like, whoa, it's weird.
Yeah.
So we expect some sound reflections. Getting rid of all of them is bad because you end up going like this. Huh? What? I don't get it. It's not good. So You need to preserve some amount of reflection to support the loudspeakers. It just needs to be the right amount. Now, here's a little bit more philosophy. What do we want in the end? I showed you this diagram with all of these red arrows going everywhere. If you get the right type and amount of absorbers and the right type and amount of scattering devices, also known as diffusers, and the right type and amount of bass absorbers, which we'll talk about later, you will end up with this. So check it out. Here's your direct sound, and here's the off-axis sounds. The far off-axis first one here is absorbed, it's not returned. The second one is scattered. It's returned, scattered evenly in the room with a lower level. Then this one's absorbed, scattered, absorbed, scattered, absorbed. Let's just say we're going to put some scattering devices on the ceiling that's going to scatter it out. So there is still some sound energy in the room, in a room that sounds good. It's smoothed out, and it has what I'm going to call binaural dissimilarity, which is the sounds that are bouncing around the room have some differences to them, and the sounds that are coming from the speakers are correlated. We'll talk about that in another video. Ultimately, the result of all of that, the feeling, is you're going to hear the direct sound, and you're going to have this really even crescent of enveloping energy. I always joke that it's like a beautiful buttery croissant that feels like, oh my God, it's smooth, it's beautiful. I feel like I want to listen to this for hours. That's where we want you to get to in the treatment. So, acoustics recipe, how do you get there? Well, there's on one of these videos, I'm actually going to show you all the math. It's really complicated equations that go, given this room volume and given these materials, here's where we want to get to in the amount of sound decay time, and here's all of the math behind it. It'll be fun to actually go through these one day. It's like really complicated Excel calculations. But I've also found over about 30 years of doing this and about 1,500 rooms done that on average, if you cover your walls and ceiling with about 15% of absorption, that's all, not much more than that, and you distribute those absorbers evenly in the room to lower the reflected energy, you're going to get to this point, it's like, wow, the room already sounds better. And then if you put another 15 to 20% of scattering devices, diffusers, so evenly interleaved with the absorbers, in different types, a 2D type that scatters the energy out on a 2D plane, or a 3D type in which the sound energy scatters it hemispherically, you're going to improve the spaciousness of the room, and it's going to sound really good. So really simple, very easy to do. In another video, we'll talk about exactly what these devices are, where you put them, how you pick them, what are the different thicknesses and what they mean. By the way, I go into rooms where they do all of the stuff only on the ceiling and not the walls, and the other way around. The sound radiates everywhere. Your ears and brain listen to it all. Don't forget to treat the ceiling. Now, finally, I also go into rooms all the time in which the absorber materials are too thin. The absorber and scattering devices are too thin, so they're only covering the upper ranges. You got to make sure you treat all this stuff all the way down into the bass region, or else it's not going to sound very good. So that's my deeper dive into the elements of acoustics that matter. I think in another video at some other point, Christopher will talk about different types of absorbers out there. They're made many different ways. How do you spec them? Where do you place them? Then we'll do another video maybe on diffusers and another video on bass absorbers if you want. It'll be fun.